In the bitter winter of 1873, Reverend Samuel Carter was betrayed by his own congregation when he chose to shelter 20 orphaned children with the last of his food, while the town starved. The townspeople, led by greed and fear, pushed him out of his own church, condemning him for his selflessness. But when the town's darkest hour seemed near, an unexpected act of generosity from railroad tycoons turned everything upside down. What followed was a tale of redemption, where love and sacrifice ultimately triumphed over scorn and betrayal. The winter of 1873 was merciless. A biting frost clung to the earth, and the wind howled through the barren streets of the small frontier town. The cold seeped into the bones of the people, and with the harsh winter came the most devastating famine they had ever known. For months, crops had failed, the rivers had frozen over, cutting off vital trade routes, and the townsfolk, once proud and resilient, now faced the grim reality of hunger. Reverend Samuel Carter, the town's pastor, had always believed that faith could carry one through any trial. But this was unlike anything he had ever imagined. He had watched his own family and congregation dwindle in health, their once vibrant spirits now weighed down by despair. And yet, in the midst of this suffering, something inside Samuel refused to break. As the weeks passed, news reached Samuel's ears of orphaned children scattered across the countryside, some of them surviving in makeshift shelters, others wandering through the snow in search of food. They were alone, with no one to care for them. It was then that Samuel made a decision. With the last of his own supplies dwindling, Samuel opened the doors of his church to those children. His meager stores of flour and salt would stretch for days, but he knew it wasn't enough. Still, he believed it was his duty to care for the innocent. 20 orphans, each with hollow eyes and gaunt faces, found shelter in the warmth of the church. And though it seemed little more than a refuge of straw and warmth, Samuel's heart swelled with the hope that, together, they might survive. But the town was a different story. The whispers started almost immediately. At first it was only a murmur, a quiet discontent. Samuel's decision to feed the children, whom they viewed as nothing more than another burden on already dwindling resources, didn't sit well with many. The small congregation, already strained by hunger and fear, began to question his actions. How could a pastor spend what little food they had on children when the rest of the town was starving? How could he, the shepherd of their souls, ignore their suffering and pour everything into the care of these orphans? Their criticism grew sharper, and soon it was no longer a whisper. It was an open outcry. And then came the betrayal. One evening, as Samuel knelt in prayer beside the children, the doors of the church were flung open with force. The cold air rushed in, and with it came a group of his own congregation, led by the town's most influential members. The faces of those he had once called his flock were hard, filled not with compassion, but with contempt. "You have abandoned us," one of them said, voice trembling with barely controlled anger. "The people are starving, and you waste what little we have on these children. You call yourself a pastor, but you're no better than a fool, spending everything we have left on strangers." Samuel stood, stunned, his heart sinking as the weight of their words crushed him. He tried to explain, tried to make them understand that these children had no one, that they were the innocent victims of this cruel winter. But his words fell on deaf ears. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could. His own congregation, those he had once served with every ounce of his being, had turned their backs on him. They accused him of neglecting his duties to the town, calling him selfish and foolish. They wanted him gone. And so, in a cruel twist of fate, Samuel was forced to leave the very church he had dedicated his life to. As he walked out into the cold night, the children huddled close to him, their small bodies shivering from more than just the cold. They had nowhere else to go. Samuel, now homeless and cast out from the place he had always called home, felt the full weight of his own sacrifice. The town he had served, the people he had trusted, had rejected him. And yet, in that bitter darkness, one thought remained. He would not abandon them. Not the children, not his faith. He would face whatever came, no matter how impossible it seemed. For as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would keep them safe. The biting winter showed no signs of relenting. The days blurred into one another, indistinguishable in their endless cold. The snow, heavy and unyielding, continued to fall, covering the land in a blanket of desolation. Hunger gnawed at Samuel's insides like a constant ache, yet he never allowed himself to show weakness in front of the children. Each morning, he would rise before dawn, his breath visible in the dim light of the church, and pray for a way out. He prayed for food, for warmth, for the strength to keep the children safe. But most of all, he prayed for hope. Hope that somehow, in the midst of this suffering, God's will would be made clear. The children, too young to understand the full weight of their situation, clung to him like the last remnants of light in an encroaching darkness. Their faces were pale, their bodies frail, yet there was a quiet peace in their eyes when they looked at him, because they knew deep down that he would never abandon them. He gave them more than just shelter. He gave them something they had lost: care, compassion, the belief that they were not forgotten. Despite his efforts to keep their spirits lifted, the days passed slowly, and with each one, the toll on Samuel grew heavier. His face was drawn with exhaustion, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights spent praying for miracles that never came. The meager rations that remained in the church were stretched to their limit, and yet Samuel continued to give what little they had to the orphans, hoping against hope that something would change. But nothing did. The town, once a place where Samuel had offered his heart and soul, had turned its back on him completely. The very people he had tried to help now spread rumors of his failure, whispering behind closed doors about the pastor who had let the town down. He was the cause of the suffering, they said. He had wasted the town's last resources on children who were no better than beggars. Each day Samuel would hear these words, sometimes shouted from doorways, sometimes muttered in passing. He should have known better, they said. He was a fool to care for them. The shame was like a heavy cloak around his shoulders, pressing him down further with each passing hour. The more he heard their condemnation, the more the weight of it settled in his heart. He couldn't escape it. The accusations stung like 1,000 needles, but it wasn't the town's judgment that cut the deepest. It was the quiet betrayal that he had never expected. How had they come to this point? How had the town he had served with all his heart, the people he had prayed for and cared for, come to believe that he had failed them? His mind often wandered back to the church, the place where he had once preached, where his voice had once echoed with the hope of salvation. Now it stood as a cold, empty shell, a symbol of all that had been lost. And in the silence of the church, Samuel would kneel and weep, not for himself, but for the townspeople, for their brokenness, for their hardened hearts. And yet, even in his moments of despair, Samuel's resolve remained unbroken. His love for the orphans burned brighter than ever. It was the only thing that kept him going, their need for him, the trust they placed in him, even when the world had abandoned them. There were nights when Samuel would not sleep at all. He would sit by the flickering candlelight, his hands trembling from hunger and fatigue, but his spirit never faltering. He would write letters to the town, to the people he had once called his own, asking them to reconsider, to open their hearts to the children. But the replies, when they came, were always the same, cold, dismissive, and full of accusations. Samuel was no longer the town's pastor. To them, he was a failure. Still, despite everything, Samuel did not give up. He would sit with the children in the darkened church, telling them stories of hope, of a God who would not forget them, no matter how dire the circumstances. His voice, though weary, was full of conviction. In their eyes, he was their only lifeline. One evening, as the cold wind howled outside, Samuel wrapped his arms around the orphans, his body trembling from exhaustion, but his heart alive with purpose. "We will survive," he whispered. "We will endure. For as long as I breathe, I will not let you go. I will not abandon you. You are not alone." It was in these quiet, desperate moments that Samuel found his strength, no longer in the approval of the town, no longer in the hope of a miracle, but in the unwavering love he had for the children. Though the town had turned their backs on him, though the world seemed to have forsaken them all, Samuel's faith was the one thing that no one could take away. The struggle was far from over. But Samuel, though weary and broken, was determined. His mission, his duty, was clear. He would fight on, for them, always for them. The town that had once turned its back on him now stood ready to rise from the ashes, renewed by the faith of one man and the compassion of those who had been moved by his example. And for Samuel Carter, the road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew this. No matter the struggles that still lay ahead, he was no longer alone. The miracle had come, and with it, the promise of a new beginning. The sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long golden rays over the half-constructed church that now stood proudly at the heart of the town. Its framework, still raw and skeletal, promised a future of strength and hope, as if the very earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Samuel stood on the dusty ground, his worn hands clasped together in silent prayer. The children, who had once huddled close in the cold, now ran freely in the open fields around the church. Their laughter, light and carefree, filled the air, a sound that, just a short time ago, had seemed like a distant dream. With each stone that was laid, with each beam of wood that was hoisted into place, Samuel's heart swelled with pride, though his shoulders still carried the weight of everything he had endured. He had been tested. Every fiber of his being had been pushed to its limits in the bitter cold and isolation. The nights when he doubted his calling, when the pain of betrayal gnawed at his spirit, those moments now seemed like distant memories, almost dreamlike in their intensity. The struggle had been long, and at times the path had felt impossibly steep. But now, as the church rose from the earth, so too did a new version of Samuel, stronger, more certain, and unwavering in his belief that sacrifice, when given with true love, would never go unnoticed. The town, which had once looked at him with suspicion, with criticism, now watched in awe as the foundation of a new era was laid. People came from far and wide to see the miracle unfolding before their eyes. They saw not just the structure of a building, but the manifestation of something greater, something born of kindness and sacrifice, something that spoke to the enduring power of faith. In the weeks that followed, the town began to change in ways Samuel had never imagined. The church became a center of life, a place where the people gathered not only for worship, but for community. The school began to take shape alongside it, a beacon of hope for the children, who now had a place to learn and grow, to build futures that had once seemed so far out of reach. And, most importantly, the orphanage provided the children with safety, care, and love, a home, a family. As the church neared completion, Samuel found himself standing before it, his heart full, his eyes fixed on the towering steeple. Beside him, the children stood hand in hand, their faces bright with joy, no longer burdened by the shadows of their past. They looked at Samuel as though he were something more than a man, a symbol of resilience, of love, and of divine grace. The townspeople, who had once whispered about him, now came forward with heads bowed in respect. The once cold and distant faces had softened, replaced by expressions of admiration and gratitude. They saw in Samuel not just a pastor, but a leader, a man who had shown them what true faith and sacrifice looked like. The scorn had melted away, replaced by a deep reverence for the strength of his character and the purity of his heart. One day, as Samuel walked through the bustling town square, a young woman approached him, one of the mothers whose children had been saved from the streets. She looked at him with eyes full of emotion, a tear trembling at the edge of her lashes. "You saved them," she said, her voice soft but full of wonder. "You saved all of us." Samuel's throat tightened. He had never seen himself as a savior, only a servant to those in need, to the children who had no one else. But in that moment, with the sun setting behind him and the town now filled with life and hope, he understood. He had not only saved others, in giving everything, he had redeemed himself. The church was more than just a building now. It was a living testament to the power of one man's love, a story of redemption that would ripple through generations. The walls would stand tall, yes, but more importantly, they would hold the memories of all those who had gathered there, those who had shared in the triumphs and challenges, who had come to understand the true meaning of sacrifice and faith. Samuel's journey was not one of glory nor of fame. It was a journey of humble service, of unflinching devotion to those who had no voice, no advocate. And in the end, it was that very devotion that brought him the respect and recognition he had long sought, not from others, but from within his own heart. The story of Samuel Carter, the pastor who had given everything for the children and the town, would not fade into the pages of history. It would become a legend, one that would be passed down through generations. And every time someone spoke of the church, of the orphanage, or of the school, they would speak of the man whose heart had been as steadfast as the walls that now stood strong before them. Redemption was not just in the triumph of the church being built, but in the transformation of a community that had once been divided, but now stood united. The love and sacrifice Samuel had shown were not forgotten, and in return, they had shaped a legacy that would last long after the walls of the church had weathered the passage of time.